And due to certain developments in new information coming in, I've had to completely re-film this segment. So this part is Were There More? And that covers the 11 Whitechapel murders. Our 5 known victims are in those cases. There's 11 Whitechapel murders and the 5 known victims are amongst them. 2 of the 11 are buried in this cemetery. The cemetery office basically had no idea about these 2 ladies being buried here. One of the ladies, who the Jack the Ripper Museum says is buried here, isn't. So that's an interesting development. So anyway, this is East London Cemetery in Plaistow, and you'll be joining me at the grave of Elizabeth Stride in a minute, where we'll be heading to tell our story. But as I say, this segment exists of Were There More? Visiting the graves in this cemetery of the people of Were There More, or approximated burial locations of the Were There More. And from there, Jack the Ripper? Question mark. And visiting Jack the Ripper's grave? Another question mark. And right at the end of the video, we'll have a little recap of the men that investigated the Whitechapel murders and the Jack the Ripper murders. So, join me at the grave of Elizabeth Stride now. And I've brought us back to the grave of Elizabeth Stride because, as I said, there's been interesting developments in what we've been doing. Very kindly, the lovely people in the cemetery office, and they've been really helpful actually, they got in touch with me a lot quicker than I thought, hence the refilming of this. They've been able to confirm that of the 11 Whitechapel murder victims, 3 of them are buried in this cemetery, namely Elizabeth Stride, Alice McKenzie and the Pinchin Street torso, who may have been the remains of Emily Barker. And a couple of things I want to highlight before we go to the museum. The Jack the Ripper Museum, it's a wonderful place and they've got some very original and interesting things, but they get a couple of things wrong. Firstly, when you go into the bedroom, and I'm pointing at Elizabeth Stride's grave to highlight this, in the museum, they pass off a picture of the young Elizabeth Stride from the 1860s as a picture of Mary Jane Kelly. There are known photographs of Mary Jane Kelly, just a contemporary image from the newspapers of the time. Bear that in mind for night 2 though, for a possible surprise. The other thing, when you go into the mortuary of the Jack the Ripper Museum, they will tell you that Frances Coles is buried in East London Cemetery. Now I've had it confirmed from the burial records here at East London Cemetery that she's not. Now, as I said, very kindly, the ladies in the cemetery office, they were able to look through the burial records for me, because the policy is now, because the books are so old and fragile, the general public can't handle them anymore, which is good because we don't want them falling apart. But they were really kind and were able to give me some great details. So I'll pause my phone. And that firstly, before we discuss the other 11 Whitechapel murder victims, is Elizabeth Stride, who we're looking at here. She was murdered on the 30th of September 1888. That was the night of the double murder. Elizabeth Stride, they think that the Ripper was disturbed when he killed her because they only found her with a cut throat, and not very long afterwards he would go on to commit another murder, obviously not having been satisfied with the first one, and that was Catherine Eddowes. But our new information is with Elizabeth Stride. We knew she was buried on the morning of Saturday the 6th of October 1888, but now we have her original grave number, which is grave 15509, and it's in square 37, and square 37 is the current day square, so you'll be able to find her through that. Now for the 11 Whitechapel murders. Were there more? We're going to discuss them, then after that you'll rejoin me here and I'll be able to take you to the approximate burial locations of Alice McKenzie and the Pinchin Street torso, who may have been Emily Barker. So, now for the 11 Whitechapel murders. Were there more? And here we see the faces of the 5 colloquial or acknowledged victims, the ladies, as I've come to refer to them: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. And on the subject of were there more victims, we see the face of the possible third victim, Martha Tabram, and the memorial stones that we visited in the City of London Cemetery of the possible first and second victims, Emma Elizabeth Smith and Annie Millward. And here are the names of the 11 Whitechapel murder victims. Emma Elizabeth Smith, 4th of April 1888. Martha Tabram, 7th of August 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, Polly, 31st of August 1888. Annie Chapman, 8th of September 1888. Elizabeth Stride, 30th of September 1888. Catherine Eddowes, 30th of September 1888, and both marked in red because they were the double murder, both killed on the same night, one after the other. Mary Jane Kelly, the 9th of November 1888. Rose Millet, or Millet, 20th of December 1888, and Rose is least likely to be one of the victims because on Thursday the 20th of December 1888, a patrolling constable found the strangled body of a 26-year-old prostitute, Rose Millet, in Clark's Yard off of Poplar High Street. Millet, born Catherine Millet, known as Drunken Lizzie Davis, and Fair Alice Downey, had lodged at 18 George Street, the same address as had Emma Elizabeth Smith. The 4 doctors who examined Milet's body thought that she had been murdered, but Robert Anderson thought that she had accidentally hanged herself on the collar of her dress while in a drunken stupor. At Anderson's request, Dr. Bond examined Milet's body, and he agreed with Anderson. Commissioner Munro suspected it was a suicide or a natural death, as there were no signs of a struggle. The coroner, Win Baxter once again, told the inquest jury that there is no evidence to show that the death was the result of violence. Nevertheless, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown, and the case was added to the Whitechapel file. Alice McKenzie, 17th of July 1889. The Pinchin Street torso, bear that name in mind for a minute. 10th of September 1889. And Francis Coles, the 13th of February 1891, the possible last murder victim, and Alice McKenzie, the Pinchin Street torso, and Francis Coles is the reason, of course, that I returned us to East London Cemetery and the grave of Elizabeth Stride and the area where they are buried. Was the Pinchin Street torso the body of Emily Barker? And massive thanks and credit to Sam Tucker for sending me these. It's really been a big help and saved me hours of research and a visit to Tower Hamlets archives. The recent Whitechapel murder. The father and mother of a girl named Emily Barker of Northampton feel convinced that she was the victim of the latest Whitechapel murder. The girl is said to have led a wild life, and the last heard of her was that she was picked up off a London doorstep in a destitute state by a London missionary. She escaped suddenly from his charge 2 days before the murder was discovered. The mother says that she is convinced of the identity and that she made one of the garments which was found by the police. Her suspicions, she says, are confirmed by the marks on the finger. The Northampton police are in communication with the force in London on the subject. And a little more on the Pinchin Street torso. On Wednesday the 10th of September 1889 at 5:15 a.m, Police Constable William Pennett found the headless and legless torso of an unidentified woman under a railway arch at Pinchin Street, Whitechapel. Extensive bruising about the victim's back, hip and arm indicated that she had been severely beaten shortly before her death, which had occurred approximately 1 day prior to the discovery of her torso. The victim's abdomen was also extensively mutilated in a manner reminiscent to the Ripper, although her genitals had not been wounded. The dismembered sections of the body are believed to have been transported to the railway arch, hidden under an old chemise. The age of the victim was estimated at 30 to 40 years. Despite a search of the area, no other sections of her body were ever found, and neither the victim nor the culprit were ever identified. So those poor parents who were convinced that that was their girl never got the chance to bury her under that name. Chief Inspector Swanson and Commissioner Munro observed that the presence of blood within the torso indicated the death was not from hemorrhage or cutting of the throat. The pathologists, however, said that the general bloodlessness of the tissues and vessels indicated that hemorrhage was the cause of death. And here we see Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. I show these faces because they're the men that investigated the Whitechapel murders, and of course they're part of the story and interesting to see their faces, as is James Munro, Commissioner of the Police of the Metropolis. Swanson did not consider this a Ripper case, and instead suggested a link to the Thames Torso murders in Rainham and Chelsea, as well as the Whitehall mystery. Munro agreed with Swanson's assessment. These 3 murders and the Pinchin Street case are suggested to be the work of a serial killer nicknamed the Torso Killer, who could either be the same person as Jack the Ripper or a separate killer of uncertain connection. And here we see the Pinchin Street torso, found 10th of September 1889 and buried in East London Cemetery in Plaistow. Alice McKenzie, 1849 to 1889. Alice McKenzie, also known as Claypipe, was murdered in the early hours of July the 17th, 1889, and immediately speculation was rife that her death might spell the return of Jack the Ripper, after a prolonged absence for the streets of the East End of some 9 months. And here, with credit to Richard Jones, we see a sketch of the latest murder by the East End assassin. And on the left you see Alice, also known as Claypipe, before she met with her unfortunate end. And on the right you see Alice McKenzie after death. And this is from the Illustrated Police News, 27th of July 1889. And this is the discovery of the body of Alice McKenzie in Castle Alley, Whitechapel. And here you see Castle Alley in Whitechapel in 1890, just 1 year after the murder, and then again in 2019, so in our own time. So you get a nice comparison then and now shot with this one. Different world, eh? Alice McKenzie was born Alice Pitts on March the 8th, 1845, in the precincts of Peterborough Minster Cathedral, Cambridgeshire, England, to Charles, a post office messenger, and Martha. Around 1860, when she was 15 years old, Alice worked for a Mrs. Strickland in her refreshment room in St. John Street, Peterborough. In 1861, aged 17, Alice no longer lived with her family, but in the household of a master brazier named Edward Miller, in High Cross Street, Leicester, where she was employed as a household servant. On October the 11th, 1863, Alice Pitts married Joseph Kinsey, or McKenzie, a 21-year-old chair and cabinet maker at All Saints Church, Leicester. 3 years later, on the 21st of July, 1866, they became the parents of Joseph James at Freeman's Common, St. Mary. Sadly, on October the 12th of the same year, baby Joseph James died of marasmus, a form of malnutrition, at 4 Joseph Street, St. Mary, Leicester. The following year, on the 18th of February, 1867, Joseph Kinsey died at the age of 25 of tuberculosis at the same place. Alice was around 22 years old, and at 22 she'd become a widow. From 1883, Alice lived off and on with an Irishman named John McCormack, also Bryant, who was in the employ of some Jewish tailors in Hamburg Street as a porter at various East End common lodging and doss houses. On Wednesday the 17th of July 1889 at 12:45 a.m. it began to rain in Whitechapel. 5 minutes later P.C. Andrews returned to Castle Alley on his regular beat, about 27 minutes having passed since he left the area. This time, however, he discovered the body of a woman laying on the pavement, her head angled towards the curb and her feet towards the wall. Blood flowed from 2 stab wounds in the left side of her neck, and her skirts had been lifted, revealing blood across an abdomen which had been mutilated. And here we see, unfortunately, the mortuary photograph of Alice McKenzie, and it is the only known photograph of her. Alice McKenzie, 40, lived at a lodging house at 52 Gun Street. It would be several hours before the body was identified. In the meantime, a description was circulated to the newspapers, with one peculiarity. Part of the nail on the thumb of the left hand was deficient. The papers also mentioned the clay pipe found near the body. Alice was buried in Plaistow Cemetery, that's East London Cemetery, on Wednesday the 24th of July 1889. And here we see, with thanks again to Sam Tucker, the Western Gazette, 16th of August 1889. The Whitechapel murder, latest news. The inquiry into the circumstances attending the death of Alice McKenzie, who was murdered in Castle Alley, Whitechapel, on July the 17th, was concluded on Wednesday. Dr. G.B. Phillips, divisional surgeon, gave evidence as to the marks on the body. He said he detected in the injuries a knowledge of how effectually to deprive a person of life, and that speedily. The injuries to the abdomen were not similar to those he had seen in other cases, neither were the injuries to the throat. The jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. And on the subject of Alice's funeral, who was buried on Wednesday the 24th of July 1889 in East London Cemetery, this article, look, the latest Whitechapel victim. The funeral of Alice McKenzie, the last Whitechapel victim, has been postponed until Wednesday at Plaistow. It doesn't say why, but her funeral had to be postponed. Here we see in the Newcastle and Evening Chronicle on the 24th of July 1889, the Whitechapel murder, funeral of the victim. The funeral of Alice McKenzie, the latest victim of the Whitechapel murderer, took place this afternoon at Plaistow Cemetery. Many of the inhabitants of the neighbourhood in which the murder was committed assembled outside the public house to which the remains were brought from the mortuary at 1:30. There was no excitement. The coffin was placed in an open hearse and was followed by 2 mourning coaches containing 3 or 4 friends of the deceased. The funeral expenses were defrayed by local subscriptions. Dover Express, 2nd of August 1889. The Whitechapel murderer. Before Mr. Lushington, at the Thames Police Court, William Wallace Brodie, 33, having no occupation and no settled abode, has been charged with being a wandering lunatic. He was further charged on his own confession with having murdered Alice McKenzie in Castle Alley in Whitechapel on the 17th of July. It is now conclusively shown that the prisoner was in bed at the time of the murder. Mr. Lushington said that he had a letter from the doctor of the prison stating that when the prisoner was admitted, he was not responsible for his actions. He was now sane. The prisoner, who deserved to be punished for what he had done, would now be discharged. The prisoner was immediately rearrested by Inspector Moore on a charge of fraud and conveyed to Clerkenwell, in which district the alleged fraud took place. And here we see the Western Gazette, 2nd of August 1889, the Whitechapel murder. Release and rearrest of Brodie. William Wallace Brodie, without fixed abode, was charged at the Thames Police Court, London, on Saturday with being a wandering lunatic, and also on his own confession with the murder of Alice McKenzie in Castle Alley in Whitechapel on the 17th. Inspector Moore said the prisoner went out to the Cape in August 1886 and only returned on the 15th. It was proved that he was in bed at the time of the murder. After his surrender, the doctor found he was insane, but certified that he was now sane. The magistrate discharged the prisoner, who, however, was immediately rearrested on a charge of fraud. The last Ripper victim, Francis Coles, 1859 to 1891. And here is a contemporary image of Francis Coles, because the only known photographer is unfortunately a mortuary one, and credit to Jack the Ripper Tours for this image. On the 13th of February 1891, Francis Coles, a 32-year-old prostitute, was found close to death under a grimy dark railway arch, with the curiously named and pretty name of Swallow Gardens, between Royal Mint Street and Chambers Street in Whitechapel. Her throat had been cut. P.C. Ernest Thompson, a newly appointed constable, made the discovery on what was the first solo beat of his police career, and just before finding Coles had heard the sound of somebody running away from the scene. Bear that in mind. Looking at the body before him, Thompson believed he saw her eyes move, suggesting she was still alive. It is now believed that she died on a stretcher on the way to the London hospital. Frances Coles from Bermondsey is believed to have worked as a prostitute in the East End for some 8 years, but like many women, this did not stop her striking up durable relationships. At the time of her death, Coles was with James Sadler, a ship's fireman who she had known on and off for some years. A rather gruff and often violent man, who frequently indulged in excessive drinking. The night before her death, the couple had been on a formidable pub crawl and had become drunk and emotional. In Fall Street, Sadler was set upon and robbed, and the fact that Coles never come to his aid or to assist him led them to argue, after which they went to their lodgings in White's Row. After a short while, Sadler left. From then on, after being refused admittance to his ship, the SS Fez, Sadler found himself in a number of drink-fuelled altercations in the area around Royal Mint Street and the docks, one of which led to a minor medical treatment and a short stay in the London hospital. He was also robbed a second time that night along the highway in Wapping. Later he was seen in a doss house selling a knife to a fellow lodger, and this became one of the reasons to arrest him on suspicion of Coles' murder. There was also briefly a suggestion that he may have been Jack the Ripper. However, investigations made into his whereabouts in 1888 put him at sea on the irrelevant dates, but he still remained the suspect for the killing of Francis Coles. He was charged on the 16th of February. But, with excellent representation from the Seamen's Union and a lack of any concrete evidence linking him to the murder, James Sadler was later acquitted of the crime. Also, the knife he had sold was apparently incapable of inflicting Coles' wounds, and it was believed that in his then incredibly intoxicated condition, Sadler would have been incapable of efficiently inflicting them. Two interesting developments came from this incident. First, a sample of Coles' blood was taken in the hopes that at some future date, some form of forensic analysis could produce some answers. Unfortunately, human blood types were not discovered until 1900, and so this proved to be fruitless and the sample was never used. And unfortunately, here is that mortuary photograph of Francis Coles, and as I said, it is the only known photograph of the lady. Secondly, and as I bear this in mind, P.C. Thompson, when discovering the body, was forbidden by policing rules to leave the body until help had arrived, and thus was unable to follow the footsteps he had heard leaving the scene. His belief that he may have let Jack the Ripper run free would haunt him for the rest of his short life. And in 1900 he received fatal stab wounds from a man named Abraham Barnett, after breaking up an altercation on Commercial Road. And here we see P.C. Ernest Thompson, 1868 to 1900, who discovered the body of Francis Coles on the 13th of February 1891. And once again, thanks to Sam for these. This is the Derby Daily Telegraph, the Whitechapel murder. The police were engaged the whole of Wednesday in searching for further evidence regarding the man Sadler, who is in custody on the charge of murdering the woman Frances Coles in Chambers Street, Whitechapel, on Friday morning. The principal detective officers also attended at the Treasury on Wednesday, where the evidence, it is understood, carefully gone over by the public prosecutor. The principal witnesses were then examined as to what they knew, and most of the evidence which is likely to be adduced against the accused is now at the Treasury. There has been no new developments concerning the murder. The prisoner Sadler persistently denies that he ever possessed the knife, which the man Campbell alleges Sadler sold to him on the morning of the murder. Bury and Norwich Post, February the 24th, 1891, the Whitechapel murder. Resumed inquest. The adjourned inquest in reference to the murder of Francis Coles was resumed on Monday by Mr. Baxter, coroner for East London at the Working Lads Institute, Whitechapel. Some evidence was given as to the movements of Sadler, who is accused of the crime. On the morning of the murder, and a sailor named Campbell who swore that he had identified him as the man who had sold him a knife on the morning of Friday the 13th. A statement made by Sadler to Inspector Swanson when he was brought to the Lemon Street station was put in and read. It gave a detailed account of his doings and whereabouts from the time he was discharged from the Fez steamer on the 11th. Mr. Oxley, the surgeon, who first was summoned when the murder was discovered, and Mr. Baxter Phillips, the divisional police surgeon, also gave evidence, and the inquiry was adjourned until Friday. You see the Edinburgh Evening News, 1st of March 1891, the Whitechapel murder. There have been no new developments in the ongoing murder. The prisoner Sadler previously denies that he ever possessed the knife, which the man Campbell alleges Sadler sold to him on the morning of the murder. Runcorn Examiner, 7th of March 1891, Whitechapel murder. Release of Sadler. At the Thames Police Court on Tuesday, John Thomas Sadler, who was charged with the murder of Francis Coles at Swallow Gardens on the 13th, was on the application of the Treasury discharged from custody. And this is interesting. The sudden death of a witness. At an inquest in London on Monday on the body of Charles Goover, aged 34 years, lately acting as a night watchman at the common lodging house in White's Row, Spitalfields, who died suddenly on Wednesday last, it was shown that the death was due to apoplexy accelerated by excitement. The deceased was one of the principal witnesses in the inquiry into the circumstances attending the murder of Francis Coles in Swallow Gardens, and had suffered from pains in the head since he had identified the body. So did the identification of that body and the shock or excitement of all this kill that man, Charles Goover? And on a more cheerful note, the faces of Alice McKenzie, Claypipe, and Francis Coles. And this piece is an add-on that I've actually had to film completely separately and totally non-intentionally, shall we say. Because I went to the cemetery. First thing I did was to go into the office and inquire about the burials. Went to the grave of Elizabeth Stride, very cold and wet I may say so. Filmed the opening segment for this bit. Got back home, and very, very shortly after that received a call from a lovely lady in the cemetery office. And I assume that they were just as interested in this as I am, because two of the people they weren't aware of. Francis Coles we'll hear about in a minute. But this post, or this little bit, is a fairly interesting and possibly important update. Firstly, with Martha Tabram. Now, as you all know from my coverage, Martha Tabram is said to be buried in the City of London cemetery, in an unmarked, unnamed grave. No burial can be found under the name of Martha Tabram for her in the City of London cemetery. So I asked them to check in East London cemetery. Now, as we're going to see in a minute, Martha went by the name of Martha Tabram, but Tabram was spelt in several different ways with a U-M, an E-M, an O-M. And also, as we're going to see in a sec, thanks to Sam Tucker, she was at one point going by the name of Turner. So, checking through the burial records again, and I spent an afternoon and an evening going through the burial records for the City of London cemetery, which are available online, by the way, for anyone that's interested. Family history, nudge nudge, wink wink. They are helpful. And nothing can be found under the name of Martha Tabram, Martha Turner, or Martha White, which is her maiden name, and nothing could be found for her under that name at the City of London cemetery. So, with this article here, and as I say, thanks to Sam, it's only that we found out that she was going by the name of Turner at one point. The Whitechapel tragedy, and I won't read the whole thing out because I have discussed aspects of it already. On Thursday, the Deputy Coroner for South East Middlesex, that's Win Edwin Baxter by the way, resumed the inquiry at Whitechapel into the circumstances attending the death of a woman supposed to be Martha Turner, who was discovered early on the morning of Tuesday the 7th, lying dead on the first floor landing of some model dwellings known as George Yard Buildings, Commercial Street, Spitalfields. The woman, when found, presented a shocking appearance, her body being covered in 39 stab wounds, this is how we know it's Martha, some of which had been done with a bayonet. Henry Samuel Tabram stated that he was a foreman packer in a furniture warehouse. He identified the body of the woman, now dead, as his wife, Martha Tabram, and she was 39 years old. He last saw her alive 18 months ago in the Whitechapel Road. Now, the rest of the article, if you want to pause and read it on yourself, it goes on like with witnesses and soldiers that were interviewed from the Tower of London, and nothing came of it, basically. But with the Turner thing, as I said, that opened up another branch for searching for that name. And then I hit some history friends, and one of them, his dad was a coroner. He's retired now. So we've all basically put all our heads together, Sam, me, some history friends, and what we have to think of is Martha died on the 7th of August 1888. It was very hot in August 1888. Now we have the luxury of, and it's awful to think of this, as people being able to be frozen or refrigerated and kept fresh. The Victorians did not always have that luxury. Body preservation then wasn't what it is now. So they very quickly took a mortuary photograph of Martha Tabram, which we can see here, for their records. And we're wondering, was it from this photograph that Martha was identified by her husband? Because this is the death certificate. She died on the 7th of August 1888 in George Yard Buildings. And the certificate was received from Win Edwin Baxter, the coroner. That's how we know that he was involved with this son. And the inquest was held from the 9th till the 23rd of August 1888. Now, Martha's body wasn't formally, there was an adjournment in between of the inquest. Martha's body wasn't formally identified until the 14th of August, that's some 7 days after her death. The inquest then didn't resume until the 16th of August, that's some 9 days after Martha Tabram's death. Her death wasn't registered until the 25th of August 1888. Now, how a coroner works is once they've ascertained how the person died, if they think they know who the person is, or if it's a person unknown, particularly in those days and in the heat, they would have had to release the body for burial and gone on what evidence they had, hence the photographs and everything like that. Martha's husband didn't identify her body until the 14th. Inquest didn't resume until the 16th, as I say, and this death wasn't registered until the 25th of August. Martha would have had to have been buried long before the death was registered. Now, as I said, I spent hours going back through the burial registers for the City of London Cemetery, and no one really stood out other than this one entry. And I photographed it, sent it to the history friend again, he sent it to his dad. And his dad suggested, because this burial, which is on the 13th of August, what we have to remember there is this burial 13th of August, Martha wasn't formally identified until the 14th, the day after this burial. Now with a coroner, they don't like presumed to be, they like is. So maybe when Edwin Baxter wasn't comfortable with releasing that body of Martha Tabram as Martha Tabram or Turner. And they only found out that she was Tabram on the 14th, day after this. So did Edwin Baxter release Martha's body as a woman unknown? Because we have here burial 21392, August the 13th, 1888, marked with an arrow and a blue line, of course. A woman unknown, Stepney, aged about 30. And this is the interesting link, because this is what links Edwin Baxter to this death and burial, district in which the death is registered. W.E. Baxter, coroner for Middlesex, that's Edwin Baxter, parish of St Mary's. It's square 312 and grave 46, and I think it's 597. Second class common interment in consecrated ground. The union from which she was removed is Whitechapel, and the ceremony was performed by the Reverend John Nicholson. And as my friend's coroner dad suggested, if she wasn't formally identified until the day after this burial, maybe the coroner didn't release her as Martha, but released her as person unknown. We'll get a little bit more of that in a minute when we go to another burial. This is only a possibility, and I am going to keep scouring every cemetery within the London vicinity of where she was possibly buried, where she was living and where she came from, things like that, until I've ruled every one of those cemeteries out and am left with only this entry as a possibility. But is this the burial entry for Martha Tabram? And with certainty, Alice McKenzie, Claypipe as she was known, she was murdered on Wednesday the 17th of July 1889. And you'll remember this article that Sam kindly sent to me. It's the funeral of Alice McKenzie. She's buried in East London Cemetery Wednesday the 24th of July 1889. And this was the article that basically said her funeral had to be postponed until the Wednesday. So we knew she was buried there, and kind of roughly where she was buried, but thanks to the lovely lady in the office, we now know where, not to an exact pinpointed grave, but certainly within a section where I'm going to be able to show you after this, where Claypipe is buried. And she was buried on the afternoon of Wednesday the 24th of July 1889 in common grave 21193. That number helps us because it gives us a section number in which she was buried. Between Elizabeth Stride and those trees I pointed out, there are sections, so we can pinpoint roughly where she's buried. And that's Alice McKenzie, Claypipe, 1849 to 1889. And you'll remember the Pinchin Street torso, the 9th Whitechapel murder. The Pinchin Street torso, found on the 10th of September 1889, and was presumed to have been killed the day before, by the way. This is the new information we have. Buried as body of an unknown woman, brought from St George in the East mortuary. That's that very mortuary, and I didn't know this at the time, that the abandoned mortuary I got inside, that Elizabeth Stride's body was taken to. So the Pinchin Street torso was also there as well. Buried on Saturday morning, which is often the sign of a pauper or very poor burial, the 5th of October 1889, in common grave 16185. And I'll be able to show you the area roughly where the Pinchin Street torso is buried, who may well be the remains of Emily Barker, because her parents, particularly her mother, swore blind that it was her, and that fragments of material found by the body was a dress made by that woman's own hands, and that she recognised marks on the finger. So, I don't know. It's a shame, and I hope that her parents were present at that burial, even though she wasn't able to be buried as Emily Barker. And finally, with the Jack the Ripper Museum, as I said, they get a lot right, and I enjoyed the museum very, very much, but they've got things wrong. Francis Coles, the last Whitechapel murder, murdered on Friday the 13th of February 1891. Now, the Jack the Ripper Museum has her buried in East London Cemetery. They've checked, although, as I said, when I went in the office and inquired, one of the ladies who's into the history knew about Francis Coles, although they didn't know about Alice McKenzie and the Pinchin Street torso. She knew about Francis Coles and had checked, and Francis is not buried in East London Cemetery. So in my searching and delving for Martha Tabram through the records of the City of London Cemetery in my afternoon and evening research, I also searched for Francis there. She's not there either. So Francis Coles' burial place remains a mystery. And of course, that one, if I do ever find it, that will have to be a separate post. And a much nicer image of Francis Coles, 1859 to 1891, although she's not buried in our cemetery. And the other thing they get wrong in the Jack the Ripper Museum, and I'll tell you now, before we go into the bedroom, this picture here, they pass for a picture of Mary Jane Kelly. There are no known images of Mary Jane Kelly. Do bear that in mind, though, for night 2, because we get a wee possible surprise on those lines. But this is actually a photograph of the young Elizabeth Stride, taken in the 1860s. Possibly in her home country, but more than likely when she was courting or dating that policeman over here in the 1860s. So this is not Mary Jane Kelly, it is Elizabeth Stride. Anyway, that's our little bit of new information that I've been able to delve and find. Massive thanks to the lady in the cemetery office. That wouldn't have been possible without Sam's help with the article and the kind help of the lady in the cemetery office, and some hours of research, which I do enjoy doing, because this mystery I am wanting to solve, and I don't like things being done wrong, particularly with the ladies. They deserve better than that. Anyway, I'll be able to show you roughly where Alice McKenzie, Claypipe, is buried, and the Pinchin Street torso, who is possibly Emily Barker. So join me back at the grave of Elizabeth Stride, and I'll walk you to those areas now. As we leave Elizabeth Stride's grave, temporarily, I'll walk you back down the little track, and I'll now take you to the last resting place of Alice McKenzie, the approximated last resting place. And what they explained to me in the office is what I've explained with several cemeteries before. This area was badly bombed in the war, and also it needed to be reused for new burials. Because of the number of old common burials in here, the best thing to do was to pile up earth to allow for new burials, and we're walking down that now. When you're looking at it, it doesn't look very high, but it's a good bit higher than the ground level here. But to take you from Elizabeth Stride, and she's buried in square 37, to Alice McKenzie, and our new information, very kindly thanks to the cemetery ladies in the office. It's Alice McKenzie. We knew she was murdered on Wednesday the 17th of July 1889 and she was buried on the afternoon of Wednesday the 24th of July 1889 in common grave 21193. Now the old numbering systems and new numbering systems are different, and her grave very likely wouldn't have been marked with a stone anyway. But the 21193 areas, where approximately she would have been, it comes to just as we come to this bend here. And it's between square 21 and square 29. So in this approximate area lie the last remains of Alice McKenzie, known as Claypipe. A little look back at Alice Claypipe. Sounds a character, doesn't she? Now, to take us to the Pinchin Street torso, who may well have been the remains of Emily Barker, I have to walk us back towards the grave of Elizabeth Stride. And the Pinchin Street torso grave is buried basically halfway between Elizabeth Stride, whose stone we can just see. Bear with me while I find it. Where is she? It's alright. The other gravestones are masking out. Oh, there we are. Elizabeth Stride is just there where the arrow is going to point now. And the Pinchin Street torso is buried between Elizabeth Stride and this bench just here. And that is in square 29. The Pinchin Street torso. Possibly Emily Barker. Body found on Tuesday the 10th of September 1889 and was believed to have died the day before, by the way. Never formally acknowledged by the police, despite her parents claiming it was her. So she was buried, and this is the new information, she was buried as body of an unknown woman on the morning of Saturday the 5th of October 1889, and early morning Saturday burials are usually a sign of a pauper or poor burial, and this was quite some time after her original death. And note that with the difference between her and Martha died in the summer and this lady died in the winter, so they obviously had more time on their hands. And the new information is grave number 16185 and square 29, and the body was kept and removed from the same mortuary we visited where Elizabeth Stride's body was taken from, the mortuary in St George in the East churchyard, and was taken to East London Cemetery and buried in an unmarked common grave. And as I said, Francis Coles is not buried here. But before we leave the site of the Pinchin Street torso, who may well be and very likely is the remains of Emily Barker, and of course we can't go to an exact grave place for Alice McKenzie, who is buried in approximately that area there, old Claypipe, and the Pinchin Street torso, most likely and very likely the remains of Emily Barker, who's buried in this section here. So we can't lay a tuppence and a God bless you on their exact grave place. So what I can do is walk us back along the little track and up here to the grave of Elizabeth Stride. And as I said, this opening scene for this part that you're hearing and seeing now had to be refilmed because of the new information that came in. And that new information, with Martha Tabram going under the Turner name and getting everyone thinking, that was thanks to Sam Tucker, who sent those newspaper clippings. The search for Martha Tabram's burial in here, which excluded that, and the other burial information that we've got from here, that was thanks to the lovely ladies in the cemetery office. The work on Martha Tabram and possible burial, I'll keep on looking in other cemeteries if I find a Martha Tabram, but it seems quite likely that that could be her, particularly as Wyn Edwin Baxter was involved in that one and mentioned on the burial register and on her death certificate too. But without exhuming loads of people, like in the case of Mary Jane Kelly, which shouldn't happen and the cemetery are never going to allow anyway, we're never probably going to truly answer that one. But as I said, for Alice McKenzie, who lies around about that area somewhere, and the Pinchin Street torso, who's buried roughly around here somewhere, we can not lay a tuppence and a God bless you on each of their graves, but we can do that on the grave of Elizabeth Stride in remembrance of them. So that's what we're going to do now. And along with all the other tuppences and flowers for Elizabeth, we're going to leave a tuppence and a God bless you to Alice McKenzie, and a tuppence and a God bless you to to the Pinchin Street torso, who is most likely the remains of Emily Barker. And are just 2 of the 11 Whitechapel murders. And now, from here, we're going to discuss the man that Russel Stephen Edwards thinks most likely to be Jack the Ripper. I mean, he's convinced of that. We'll have a recap with who was Jack the Ripper, and then from here at the grave of Elizabeth Stride, you're going to join me at East Ham Jewish Cemetery in Marlow Road for potentially what is the grave of Jack the Ripper, which we'll go and see. So, first for a recap on who was Jack the Ripper. Montague John Druitt, 1857 to 1888, was a Dorset-born barrister who worked to supplement his income as an assistant schoolmaster in Blackheath in London until his dismissal shortly before his suicide by drowning in 1888. He was said to be sexually insane and was allegedly suspected of being the Ripper by members of his own family. His death shortly after the last canonical murder, which was Mary Jane Kelly by the way, which took place on the 9th of November 1888, led Inspector Chief Sir Melville McNacton to name him as a suspect in a memorandum of the 23rd of February 1894. And Sir Melville here did suspect Montague John Druitt of being Jack the Ripper. However, Inspector Frederick Aberline appeared to dismiss Druitt as a serious suspect on the basis that only the evidence against him was his coincidental timing of his suicide shortly after the last canonical murder. Joseph Eisenschmidt, or Joseph Eisenschmidt, 1845 to unknown, was a Swiss butcher living in the Milford Road. He suffered from severe depression and psychiatric disorders and had a history of violent attacks on women in the Whitechapel area, which had seen him hospitalised for psychiatric treatment in the past. He was arrested on the 13th of September, and a psychiatric evaluation found that he was violently insane and potentially dangerous, with a judge ordering him imprisoned in a mental hospital. However, the double event murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, which occurred on the 30th of September, while Eisenschmidt was in the hospital, exonerated him from the murders. Cyril Antonowitz Kowalski, alias George Chapman, alias the Dandy of Cable Street, 1865 to 1903. Was born in Congress in Poland, but emigrated to the United Kingdom sometime between 1887 and 1888, shortly before the start of the Whitechapel murders. He successively poisoned 3 of his wives and became known as the Barrow Poisoner. He was hanged for his crimes in 1903. At the time of the Ripper murders, he lived in Whitechapel, London, where he had been working as a barber under the name of Ludwig Schlodsky. Chapman was Inspector Frederick Aberline's favourite suspect, and the Pall Mall Gazette reported that Aberline suspected Chapman after his conviction. However, others disagree that Chapman is likely culprit, as he murdered his 3 wives with poison, and it is uncommon, though not unheard of, for a serial killer to change to a drastic change in the way or method that they kill. Michael Ostrog, circa 1833 to circa 1904, was a Russian-born professional conman and thief. He used numerous aliases, assumed titles amongst his many dubious claims, was that he had once been a surgeon in the Russian Navy. He was mentioned by McKenzie, and who joined the case in 1889, the year after the Canonical 5 victims were killed. Researchers have failed to find evidence that he had committed crimes in any more serious than fraud or theft. Author Philip Sugden discovered prison records showing that Ostrog was jailed for petty offences in France during the Ripper murders. Ostrog was last mentioned alive in 1904. The date of his death is unknown. John Pizer, or Pizer, circa 1850 to 1897, was a Polish Jew who worked as a bootmaker in Whitechapel in the early days of the Whitechapel Murders. Many locals suspected that Leather Apron was the killer, which was picked up by the press, and Pizer was known as Leather Apron. He had a prior conviction for stabbing offence, and Police Sergeant William Thick apparently believed that he had committed a string of minor assaults on prostitutes. Here is Sergeant William Thick. After the murders of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman in late August and early September 1888 respectively, Hick arrested Pizer on the 10th of September, even though the investigating inspector reported that there is no evidence whatsoever against him. He was cleared of suspicion when it turned out that he had alibis for 2 of the murders. He was staying with relatives at the time of one of the murders, and he was talking with the police officer while watching a spectacular fire on the London docks at the other incident. And on to our next suspect. James Thomas Sadler, born circa 1837, died 1906 or 1910, and he was a friend of Francis Cole's, the last victim added to the Whitechapel murder police file. Francis Coles was murdered on the 13th of February 1891, and we saw a little bit about her, didn't we? And still looking for her burial. Sadler was arrested, but little evidence existed against him. Though briefly considered by the police as a Ripper suspect, he was at sea at the time of the first 4 canonical murders and was released without charge. Sadler was named in Sir Melville McKenzie's 1894 memorandum in connection with Francis Cole's murder. McKenzie thought Sadler was a man of ungovernable temper and entirely addicted to drink and the company of the lowest prostitutes. And the 1894 memorandum written by Sir Melville McKenzie, Assistant Chief Constable for the London Metropolitan Police, naming Aaron Kosminski and Montague Druitt as 2 of the 3 preferred suspects of Jack the Ripper case. Francis Tumblety, 1833 to 1903, earned a small fortune posing as an Indian herb doctor throughout the United States and Canada, and was commonly perceived as a misogynist and a quack. He was connected to the death of one of his patients but escaped prosecution. In 1865, he was arrested for alleged complicity in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but no connection was found and he was released without being charged. Tumblety was in England in 1888 and was arrested on the 7th of November, apparently for engaging in homosexual acts which were illegal at the time. It was reported by some of his friends that he showed off a collection of matrices, wombs, from every class of woman at around this time. Awaiting trial, he fled to France and then to the United States, Already notorious in the States for his self-promotion and previous criminal charges, his arrest was reported as a connection to the Ripper murders. And here is a newspaper article about Francis Tumblety from the New York Times in November 1888. Pause to read that if you want to, because I'll be moving on in a sec. Moving on now. In 1913, Tumblety was mentioned as a Ripper suspect by Chief Inspector John Littlechild of the Metropolitan Police Service in a letter to journalist and author George R. Sims. It is well known that at the time of his death, Francis Tumblety had 2 cheap imitation gold rings on his finger, just like the ones missing from Annie Chapman's body. At the time of her murder, was he Jack the Ripper? Now this one interested me. It's quite unlikely to be Jack the Ripper, but what he said on the gallows just drew my interest. Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, born 1850 and executed in 1892 at Newgate Prison, and was a doctor secretly specialising in abortions. He was born in Glasgow and educated in London and Canada, and entered practice in Canada and later in Chicago, Illinois. In 1881, he was found guilty of a fatal poisoning of his mistress's husband. He was imprisoned in Illinois State Penitentiary in Joliet, Illinois, from November 1881 until his release on good behaviour on the 31st of July 1891. So he was basically in prison at the time of the Whitechapel murders, but he moved to London, where he resumed killing and was soon arrested. He was hanged on the 15th of November 1892 at Newgate Prison. According to some sources, his last words were reported to be, and this is on the gallows, "I'm Jack the..." And he never got the rest out, because before he could get anything more than the, that man was plunged into non-existence at the hands of the hangman. And this was interpreted to mean, "I'm Jack the Ripper." As he was still imprisoned at the time of the Ripper murders, most authorities consider it impossible for him to have been the culprit. However, Donald Bell suggests that he could have bribed officials and left prison before his official release. Sir Edward Marshall Hall suspected that his prison term may have been served by a look-alike in his place. Such notions are unlikely and contradict evidence given by Illinois authorities, newspapers of the time, Cream's solicitors and Cream's family and Cream himself. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? The Thomas Neil Cream. "I'm Jack the..." Was he just a maniac seeking some kind of weird glorification in the very last moments of his life? Or was he Jack the Ripper? And this one, of course, like all the others, is interesting. But this is Russel Stephen Edwards' only culprit, really. I mean, if you go into Russell's page, you'll see a lot of the work and that he's put into it. And whether you buy the theory or not, you do have to admire the effort and work that he's put into a lot of this. Aaron Kosminski, born Aaron Mort Kosminski, born September 1865 in Poland, and he died on the 24th of March 1919 at Leavesden Hospital in Hertfordshire in England. Aaron Kosminski was admitted to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. He was named as a suspect by Sir Melville Macnaghten in 1894 memorandum, and by former Chief Inspector Donald Swanson in handwritten comments in the margin of his copy of Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson's memoirs. Anderson wrote that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly I identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. Aaron was apparently Aaron also apparently fit their profile. A sexual maniac of a virulent type. That he was also living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and that if he was not living immediately alone, his people knew of his guilt and refused to give him up to justice. Furthermore, a house-to-house search was conducted for the case of every man in the district whose circumstances were such that he could go and come and get rid of his bloodstains in secret. Sir Robert Anderson goes on to state that the conclusion of the police came to the following. This investigation was that if Jack the Ripper and his people were certain low-class Polish Jews, but since the person who identified him was also a Polish Jew, and people of that class in the East End will not give up one of their number to Gentile justice, the suspect was never prosecuted. Anderson was firmly convinced of the suspect's guilt, also writing within the Whitechapel Murders section of his memoirs that undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the Jack the Ripper's crimes are not within that category. Some authors are sceptical of this, while others use it in their theories. Aaron Kosminski lived in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. However, when later sectioned, he was largely harmless in the asylum. His insanity took the form of auditory hallucinations, a paranoid fear of being fed by other people, and a refusal to wash or bathe, and self-abuse. In 2004, DNA analysis tenuously linked Kosminski with the shawl said to have belonged to the victim Catherine Eddowes, but experts including Professor Sir Alec Jeffreys, the inventor of genetic fingerprinting, dismissed the DNA claims about Kosminski as unreliable. This was because the genetic match determined from maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski was based on mitochondrial DNA. Strands of mitochondrial DNA can be shared by thousands of people and therefore can only be reliably used in crime analysis to exclude a suspect, not implicate them. And this is where Russel Stephen Edwards comes in, because he is the owner of that shawl that is said to have belonged to Catherine Eddowes. Russel Edwards with the shawl found at the scene of Jack the Ripper's fourth murder. The garment was passed down from a policeman who kept it. Russell has used DNA testing on the stains found on the shawl to identify the killer, a Polish-born Aaron Kosminski. And this is from a newspaper article thing from BBC a few years ago. In March 2019, the Journal of Forensic Science published a study that claimed DNA from Kosminski and Catherine Eddowes was found on the shawl. A BBC documentary, Jack the Ripper, The Case Reopened, broadcast the same year and presented by Amelia Fox, was concluded that Kosminski was the most likely suspect. So what do you think? Was Aaron Kosminski Jack the Ripper? He is the only grave really in London or East London that I'll be able to take you to, and that's where we're going to go now. So join me at East Ham Jewish Cemetery. Good afternoon, ladies and gents, and you join me at East Ham Jewish Cemetery, also known as Marlow Road Jewish Cemetery, because it happens to be at the end of Marlow Road in East Ham. But I'm taking you now to what is potentially the grave of Jack the Ripper, Aaron Kosminski, who died on the 27th of March 1919. Now, I covered this cemetery before a little while ago, and when I did find his grave, I left it out of my tour because I did have a Jack the Ripper tour series planned deliberately. So as I said, I left that one out. But on my last visit, there was a plaque on the grave, but the plaque has gone now. So whether someone told me that it's been taken away because the cemetery didn't like having the highlight of having a potential Jack the Ripper buried in here, and someone else told me that the plaque has been taken away because it's going to be altered. We're within the cemetery now, and I shall take you to his grave. Sorry, I had to point you away, then there's some people there. Yeah, as I say, on my last visit there was a plaque on a little stone tablet. The plaque has gone now. One person told me that the cemetery didn't like the prominence of Aaron Kosminski, possibly Jack the Ripper, being buried in their cemetery, so they took the plaque away. And someone else told me the plaque has been taken away to be altered. So, goodness knows. But when you come into the cemetery, you walk straight in and straight down, of course, and you look for this tree here. You'll next want to look for this first bench on the right, which is worthy and will get a mention in its own right. Presented by Mr. and Mrs. Louis Ackett, in loving memory of members of our family who lost lives in a concentration camp. So as I say, you come to that bench and you'll look for these two very white looking headstones. In loving memory of Annie, the beloved wife of Jacob Sion, is this one. And this is the row that he's buried on, with your tree right in front of you. So now, Russel Stephen Edwards' extensive work, he's convinced that what we are going to see is the grave of Jack the Ripper. And here is that grave. And you can just make out the O.N. Kosminski. It's very worn away. O.N. Kosminski. And as I said, there was a plaque on the grave. The stone tablet is still there, but the plaque is gone. I'll show you that at the end of this little snippet. But what do you think, ladies and gents? Do you think that this is the last resting place of Jack the Ripper? I mean, the constabulary of the time, or some of them, were convinced that this was their man, although Inspector Aberline believed that George Chapman, the dandy of Cable Street, was the man. So goodness only knows. That's part of the mystery which keeps us all wondering, isn't it? Look, oh, you can see it better now. There's some like O.N. Kosminski. Now, I'll show you a picture from Find a Grave of his plaque, which is missing, and then after that, as I said, some of the constabulary believe this to be their man, so there'll be a little bit of historical information on that. And as I said, I would show you a picture of that missing plaque for Aaron Kosminski, and here it is. It's an interesting thing to consider where it's gone. And also, as I said on our tour on night 1 with Matt, I'll leave it up to you to go on Russel Stephen Edwards' page, view everything that he's done and looked into and researched and whatnot, and make up your own minds whether you think we've just looked at the grave of Jack the Ripper. PC 55H Jonas Mizzen was the first police constable at the murder scene of Mary Ann Nichols. Divisional Inspector Joseph Lunis and Dr. George Baxter Phillips were the first constabulary present at the murder scene of Annie Chapman. Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered at approximately 1 a.m. on Sunday the 30th of September 1888 in the adjacent Duffields Yard by Louis Demschutz, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club. PC Edward Watkins discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. You'll see quite a few of PC Watkins' items in the Jack the Ripper Museum. If that's your thing, give that a watch. That will be the video that follows after this one in a day or so. Thomas Boyer discovering the body of Mary Jane Kelly, the worst of all the murders. Boyer ran to the police station, stammering the words, "Another one, Jack the Ripper, awful. John McCarthy sent me," to Inspector Walter Beck. Beck accompanied Boyer to Millier's Court and immediately requested the assistance of Police Surgeon George Baxter Phillips. Here we see Inspector Beck from the Illustrated Police News on 24th of November 1888. The investigation was initially conducted by Metropolitan Police Whitechapel H Division Criminal Investigation Department, headed by Detective Inspector Edmund Reed. After the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore and Walter Andrews were sent from Central Office, Scotland Yard to assist. Here is Henry Moore. In September 1888, he was seconded from Scotland Yard to Whitechapel to strengthen the investigation into the Whitechapel murders, which were blamed on a character known as Jack the Ripper. Shortly after Mary Ann Nichols' murder case, by July 1889, he had taken over from Inspector Frederick Aberline as the lead investigating officer in the case. He remained the lead detective until 1896, by which time the murderer, who was never caught, and the case appeared to be inactive. Inspector Walter Andrews, 1847 to 1869, joined the Metropolitan Police CID. In December 1888, sent from London to New York, possibly in connection with an investigation into Francis Tumblety, and he retired in 1889. Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson, 1848 to 1924, was a senior police officer in the Metropolitan Police in London during the notorious Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. And Detective Constable Walter Dew. Early in 1887, Dew was transferred to Commercial Street Police Station in H Division in Whitechapel, where he was a detective constable in the Criminal Investigation Department during the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. And Blind Man's Buff, this is a Punch cartoon, John Tenniel, 22nd of September 1888, criticising the police's alleged incompetence The failure of the police to capture the killer reinforced the attitude held by radicals that the police were inept and mismanaged. And I didn't want our series to end in a cold, wet graveyard, being about Jack the Ripper or anyone else other than the ladies. So we're going to end off at the very place where William Nichols and Mary Ann Nichols married, St Bride's Church. And although the church was much changed by the war, they would have stood at the altar at this point and taken their vows. And I really didn't want this to be a sad ending, so I'm going to take us to neutral ground, shall we say. And we'll be leaving St Bride's now. That's some lovely evening footage in there, and of a happy memory of when two people took their vows and set out on what they thought was going to be a happy life together. It's said that when William Nichols, later in life, he said that as soon as he saw Mary Ann like that, when he had to go and identify the body and see the body, he forgave her everything. And it was nice to learn that William was able to start another life for himself and married again. But I'm going to take us to a place that isn't associated with any of our Ripper victims, any of the ladies, with Jack, or any of the men that investigated the place, the murders, or anything like that. I wanted to end us off on a more cheerful element, so on that note, in the words of a Victorian, come inside and have a warm by the fire, the Lord bless you. You can't beat a nice fire. So, although none of our victims ever came here, I thought I would end us off on neutral ground, so to speak. So, on that note, we raise a glass to the memory of the 11 Whitechapel murder victims, all of them. So let's raise a glass to